All right, everyone, welcome back to the English Globe, where we explore important global stories through calm and thoughtful conversations. Today's episode begins with a question that many political analysts and international observers are asking right now. Tensions around Iran have once again captured global attention, and news headlines across the world are discussing military movements, diplomatic messages, and growing concerns about stability in the Middle East. Whenever events in this region become tense, governments, markets, and international organizations begin watching very carefully because the Middle East has always been one of the most strategically sensitive regions on the planet, where a single political decision can influence energy markets, international alliances, and global security discussions almost immediately.
That's absolutely right, Adam. And when a crisis begins to develop in such an important region, the global audience usually looks toward the world's most powerful countries to see how they will respond. Governments, journalists, and policy experts pay close attention not only to official statements, but also to diplomatic signals, military positioning, and economic reactions. However, something unusual has caught the attention of many observers this time. While discussions about Iran are dominating international headlines, two major global powers appear to be responding in a surprisingly calm and cautious way. And that naturally raises a very interesting question that we want to explore in today's conversation.
Exactly, Julia. And that question is both simple and complex at the same time. If tensions around Iran are so serious, and if the Middle East plays such a critical role in global security and energy supply, then why do Russia and China appear relatively quiet compared to what many people expected? These are not small or distant actors in global politics. Both Moscow and Beijing are powerful countries with large economies, strong diplomatic networks, and growing influence in international affairs. Yet their public responses often sound measured, careful, and sometimes even restrained, which makes analysts wonder whether this quiet approach is a deliberate strategy rather than simple hesitation.
And that is where international politics becomes really fascinating. Because silence in diplomacy does not necessarily mean inaction. In many cases, governments choose their words very carefully, especially when a situation is still developing and when several powerful countries are involved. Russia and China both maintain important relationships with Iran, but they also have to think about broader global stability, economic connections, and their long-term strategic interests. Because of this, their responses often reflect a complex balance between support, caution, and careful observation, which makes their diplomatic behavior very interesting for anyone trying to understand how global power politics actually works.
To understand this situation properly, we also need to take a step back and briefly look at what is happening in the Middle East right now. Iran sits at the center of a region that has experienced political tension, security challenges, and strategic competition for many decades. The country's geographic location, its political influence in regional affairs, and its role in global energy markets make it extremely important for many governments around the world. Whenever tensions rise around Iran, the effects are rarely limited to one country or one region, because international markets, security alliances, and diplomatic relations can all be affected by events that happen there.
Exactly, and that is why the reactions of major powers matter so much. In global politics, countries like the United States, Russia, and China often play significant roles in shaping how international crises develop. Each of these powers approaches the situation from a different perspective, based on its strategic priorities, alliances, and long-term geopolitical goals. The United States has strong security partnerships in the Middle East and has been deeply involved in regional diplomacy for decades. Russia has expanded its influence in parts of the region in recent years, while China has developed strong economic connections with many Middle Eastern countries through trade and energy partnerships.
So when tensions rise around Iran, the actions and statements of these three major powers often become central to global discussions. The United States typically emphasizes security concerns and regional stability, especially because many of its long-standing allies are located in the Middle East. Russia often approaches the region through a combination of strategic influence and diplomatic engagement, while China generally focuses on economic stability and long-term trade relationships. These different priorities mean that each country views the situation through its own strategic lens, which explains why their responses may sometimes appear very different from one another.
And this is exactly what we are going to explore throughout today's episode. Our goal is not simply to follow headlines or repeat dramatic political statements. Instead, we want to take a step back and examine the deeper strategic thinking that often shapes the behavior of powerful countries. We will look at how diplomacy works behind the scenes, how economic interests influence political decisions, and how major powers try to protect their long-term influence without increasing tensions unnecessarily. By examining these factors carefully, we can begin to understand why Russia and China might prefer a quieter and more cautious approach when tensions around Iran begin to rise.
Another important part of today's discussion is understanding how global power politics works in a world where many interests overlap. Modern international relations are rarely simple or predictable. Governments must think about security concerns, economic partnerships, domestic politics, and international reputation all at the same time. Because of this complexity, powerful countries sometimes choose strategies that appear subtle rather than dramatic. What might look like silence on the surface can actually be a deliberate attempt to maintain stability, avoid escalation, and keep diplomatic options open while carefully observing how events develop.
And that is why today's conversation is especially valuable for our listeners. By exploring this situation step by step, we can better understand the strategic calculations that influence global decisions. We will talk about diplomacy, economics, energy politics, and the broader competition between major powers in the 21st century. These discussions help us see how international relations works beyond simple headlines and emotional reactions. Instead of viewing global events as isolated incidents, we begin to see them as part of a larger system where every action, every statement, and even every moment of silence can carry important meaning.
So in today's episode, we will explore several key questions that are shaping global conversations right now. Why do Russia and China appear relatively cautious in their public reactions to tensions involving Iran? What strategic interests do they have in the Middle East? And how do those interests influence their diplomatic behavior? How do economic factors like energy supply and international trade shape the decisions of major powers? And finally, what does this situation tell us about the broader balance of power in the modern international system, where cooperation, competition, and careful diplomacy often exist at the same time?
By the end of this episode, our goal is for you to have a clearer understanding of how global powers think and why their responses to international crises are sometimes more complicated than they first appear. We will analyze strategy, diplomacy, economics, and geopolitical influence while keeping the conversation calm, balanced, and thoughtful. Because understanding global politics requires patience and careful observation, and today's topic offers a perfect opportunity to explore how the world's most powerful countries make decisions when the international spotlight suddenly turns toward a region as important and sensitive as the Middle East.
Julia, before we analyze the reactions of the world's major powers, it is very important for our listeners to first understand the background of the current tensions involving Iran. In international politics, every crisis has a history, and the situation around Iran is connected to decades of political disagreements, security concerns, and competing strategic interests in the Middle East. Over the years, Iran has had complicated relationships with several countries in the region, as well as with Western powers, particularly the United States. Periodically, these tensions increase because of military incidents, political disagreements, or concerns about regional influence. And when that happens, governments and global markets immediately begin paying attention.
Exactly, Adam. And one of the reasons the situation becomes global news so quickly is because the Middle East is not just any region. It plays a central role in global energy supply, international trade routes, and geopolitical competition. When tensions rise in this region, it rarely stays limited to one country or one political disagreement. Instead, the entire international system begins reacting because many countries depend on stability in the Middle East for economic and security reasons. That is why even small incidents can quickly become major international discussions, with governments, analysts, and organizations trying to understand what might happen next.
That's a very important point, Julia, and Iran itself occupies a very strategic position in global geography. The country sits between Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Persian Gulf, which means it is located near some of the most important energy routes in the world. Large amounts of global oil and energy resources move through this region, and any tension that threatens stability can influence international markets almost immediately. Because of this geographic importance, Iran has long been considered one of the key political and strategic players in the region, and its relationships with other countries often influence the broader balance of power in the Middle East.
And when we talk about geopolitical importance, we are also talking about influence, alliances, and strategic partnerships. Countries in international politics rarely act alone. They usually operate through networks of relationships that include diplomatic cooperation, economic agreements, and security arrangements. Iran has built various partnerships and political connections across the region, while at the same time, it has disagreements with some neighboring states and Western governments. This mixture of cooperation and rivalry creates a very complex political environment where every new development can influence several countries at the same time.
Another important factor that makes Iran such a significant country in global politics is its role in energy markets and international trade routes. The Persian Gulf region holds a large portion of the world's oil reserves, and many countries rely on energy supplies that pass through nearby waterways. Because of this, stability in the region is extremely important, not only for Middle Eastern countries, but also for major economies in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Whenever tensions increase, investors, governments, and international organizations begin evaluating possible economic consequences, which shows how closely global stability is connected to events in this region.
Yes, and this is where we start to see why global powers become interested in the situation even when they are geographically far away. Countries like the United States, Russia, and China all have strategic interests connected to the Middle East. Some of these interests are related to energy security, while others involve diplomatic influence, economic partnerships, or long-term geopolitical competition. Because of these interests, major powers closely monitor developments around Iran, and they often try to shape events through diplomacy or international negotiations rather than direct confrontation.
Another concept that helps us understand this situation is the idea of regional stability. In international relations, regional stability refers to a condition where countries in a particular area maintain predictable relationships, avoid major conflicts, and manage disagreements through diplomatic channels. When stability exists, trade flows smoothly, political cooperation becomes easier, and governments can focus on economic development instead of security concerns. However, when tensions rise between key countries in a region, the risk of instability increases, and that can create uncertainty for many other nations that depend on that region's political balance.
And that uncertainty is exactly what governments try to avoid whenever possible. Global powers often encourage diplomatic solutions because large-scale conflicts can disrupt international markets, create humanitarian challenges, and weaken economic growth around the world. This is why we frequently hear calls for dialogue, negotiations, and calm responses whenever tensions increase. Countries understand that the consequences of instability in a region like the Middle East can extend far beyond national borders, affecting everything from energy prices to global transportation networks and international security arrangements.
This brings us to another key concept in global politics, which is strategic interests. Every country has national interests that guide its foreign policy decisions, and these interests often include economic prosperity, national security, international influence, and political stability. When a crisis occurs, governments evaluate the situation by asking how it might affect these core interests. For some countries, the priority might be maintaining energy supply routes, while for others it might involve protecting allies or preventing regional conflicts from expanding further.
And alliances also play a major role in shaping how countries respond to crises. An alliance is essentially a partnership between countries that agree to cooperate in areas such as security, diplomacy, or economic development. In the Middle East, several alliances exist between regional states and global powers, and these partnerships influence how governments interpret new developments. When tensions rise around Iran, different countries evaluate the situation through the lens of their alliances, their economic interests, and their broader strategic goals, which often leads to a wide range of reactions across the international community.
What makes the Iran situation particularly complex is that it sits at the intersection of all these factors. There are historical disagreements, regional rivalries, economic considerations, and global strategic interests, all interacting at the same time. This complexity means that every development is closely analyzed by diplomats, security experts, and political leaders across the world. Understanding these layers helps us move beyond simple headlines and begin to see the deeper structure of international relations that influences how governments respond.
And this deeper understanding is exactly what we want to build in today's episode. Instead of focusing only on dramatic news moments, we are examining the broader context that shapes the behavior of powerful countries. By looking at geography, alliances, economic connections, and strategic priorities, we can start to see why certain countries respond loudly while others respond more cautiously. These decisions are rarely accidental. They are usually the result of careful calculations about risks, opportunities, and long-term influence.
So as we continue our discussion, remember that the situation around Iran is not only about one country or one event. It is part of a much larger system of global politics where regional dynamics, economic interests, and international power competition all interact. In the next section, we will take a closer look at one of the most important relationships influencing this situation, the strategic connection between Russia and Iran, and why that partnership does not always translate into loud political support during moments of crisis. Julia, now that we understand the broader context of the Iran crisis, it is time to explore one of the most important relationships influencing the situation, the connection between Russia and Iran. Many people assume that because both countries often criticize Western influence, they must be close allies that always support each other during crises. However, the reality of international politics is much more complex. Russia and Iran cooperate in many areas, including diplomacy, energy, and military technology, but their relationship is better described as a strategic partnership rather than a formal alliance. This means they work together when their interests align, yet they still maintain independent strategies and priorities.
That distinction is extremely important, Adam. When we look at history, Russia and Iran have not always been close partners. In fact, their relationship has changed many times over the past century, depending on global political conditions. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran faced isolation from many Western countries, and that pushed Tehran to explore cooperation with other powers, such as Russia. Over time, Moscow became an important supplier of military technology and technical expertise for Iran, especially because Western countries were unwilling to provide those systems. This gradual cooperation slowly built a strategic relationship between the two countries.
Yes, and the relationship became even more visible during certain regional conflicts, particularly in the Middle East. One important example was the Syrian conflict that began in the early 2000s. Both Russia and Iran supported the Syrian government and coordinated their military and diplomatic efforts there. This cooperation allowed them to strengthen communication between their military leaders and build a more organized partnership. These kinds of joint activities created the perception that Russia and Iran were forming a powerful geopolitical axis in the region, even though their cooperation was mostly based on shared short-term interests rather than a permanent alliance.
Another key factor shaping their partnership is military cooperation. Over the years, Russia has been an important source of defense technology for Iran, including aircraft, radar systems, and training programs for military personnel. For Iran, this cooperation was especially valuable because it helped strengthen its defense capabilities during periods when sanctions limited access to Western technology. At the same time, Russia also benefits from this relationship because selling military equipment supports its defense industry and expands its influence in the Middle East. In other words, the cooperation serves practical interests on both sides.
In recent years, this military cooperation has taken new forms as global politics has changed. After the escalation of conflict in Ukraine, reports suggested that Iran supplied drones and other military equipment to Russia, which significantly deepened their defense partnership. In return, Russia has reportedly provided Iran with various forms of military and technological assistance. This exchange illustrates how international partnerships often evolve depending on strategic needs. When two countries face pressure from similar geopolitical challenges, they sometimes find opportunities to support each other in ways that strengthen their broader strategic position.
But even though this cooperation sounds very strong, it is still important to remember that Russia and Iran do not have a formal military alliance similar to the defense agreements seen in some other parts of the world. In fact, when the two countries signed a long-term strategic partnership agreement in 2025 to expand economic, technological, and political cooperation, the treaty did not include a mutual defense clause that would require them to fight for each other if one were attacked. This shows that both countries want to cooperate closely while still maintaining independence in their foreign policy decisions.
And that independence becomes especially visible when we examine their long-term strategic interests. Russia views the Middle East as an important region for maintaining geopolitical influence, managing energy markets, and expanding diplomatic relationships with different governments. Because of these goals, Moscow tries to maintain communication with many different countries in the region, including states that do not always agree with Iran. For example, Russia has maintained dialogue with countries such as Israel and several Gulf states, which means Moscow must carefully balance its relationships rather than fully align with one side of every regional dispute.
That balancing strategy explains why Russia often reacts cautiously when tensions involving Iran become serious. If Moscow openly supported Iran in every conflict, it could damage Russia's relationships with other important partners in the Middle East. Diplomatic influence in the region requires flexibility and communication with many different governments, and Russia understands that taking extremely strong positions could limit its ability to act as a mediator or a strategic player in regional politics. So instead of loud public support, Russia frequently chooses more measured diplomatic statements and quiet negotiations.
Another reason Russia avoids full support during crises is related to economic competition. While Russia and Iran cooperate in some areas, they also compete in others, especially in the global energy market. Both countries are major producers of oil and gas, and both depend heavily on energy exports for economic revenue. Because of this, their long-term economic interests do not always perfectly align. Sometimes they cooperate to influence energy markets, but at other times they compete for similar customers and trade routes. This mixture of cooperation and competition creates a relationship that is complex, rather than purely supportive.
And this complexity is exactly why analysts often describe the Russia-Iran relationship as pragmatic rather than ideological. In other words, their partnership is driven more by practical needs than by deep political unity. When their strategic goals overlap, cooperation can become very strong. But when their interests diverge, each country prioritizes its own national strategy. This kind of flexible partnership is very common in international relations, where countries constantly adjust their policies based on changing circumstances and opportunities.
This helps explain why Russia's response during major tensions involving Iran often appears cautious. Even though Moscow values its partnership with Tehran, it must also consider other global priorities, including its own security challenges, economic interests, and diplomatic relationships with other countries. Supporting Iran too aggressively could create risks that Russia is not willing to accept, especially when global tensions are already high. As a result, Russia frequently chooses a strategy that combines diplomatic support with careful distance from direct confrontation.
And that strategy reflects a broader principle in global politics. Powerful countries often prefer flexibility over rigid alliances. By maintaining strategic partnerships instead of strict defense commitments, they keep more options available when situations change. Russia's relationship with Iran demonstrates this approach clearly. The two countries cooperate in areas such as defense technology, economic development, and regional diplomacy, but they also maintain enough independence to protect their own long-term interests.
So when people ask why Russia sometimes appears quiet during crises involving Iran, the answer lies in this delicate balance of cooperation and independence. Moscow values its partnership with Tehran, yet it also recognizes that its global strategy requires careful diplomacy, multiple regional relationships, and the ability to avoid unnecessary confrontation. In international relations, silence can sometimes be a strategic decision rather than a sign of weakness. And Russia's cautious approach toward Iran illustrates how major powers often operate in a complex and interconnected world. Julia, after discussing Russia's complex relationship with Iran, it is also important for us to look at another major global power whose reaction has been equally careful and measured: China. Over the past 2 decades, China has become one of the most influential economic players in the world, and its foreign policy often focuses heavily on stability, trade, and long-term partnerships. Because of this approach, whenever tensions rise in regions like the Middle East, Beijing usually responds in a calm and cautious manner. Instead of dramatic political statements or strong military positioning, Chinese leaders often emphasize dialogue, economic cooperation, and diplomatic solutions that can reduce tensions rather than increase them.
That's absolutely true, Adam. And to understand China's careful approach, we need to recognize how important the Middle East has become for China's economy. China is the world's second-largest economy, and its massive industrial system requires a constant and reliable supply of energy resources. Many of those resources come from the Middle East, which remains one of the world's most important energy-producing regions. Countries across the Persian Gulf export significant amounts of oil and gas, and China imports a large share of its energy from this region. Because of this dependence, stability in the Middle East is extremely important for China's economic growth and long-term development.
Exactly, Julia. And when a country depends heavily on energy imports from a particular region, it naturally prefers policies that reduce the risk of conflict there. If tensions escalate into large-scale instability, global energy markets can experience sudden disruptions, which could affect China's economic stability and industrial production. This is why Chinese leaders often emphasize the importance of peace, regional cooperation, and diplomatic engagement whenever tensions rise around countries like Iran. From Beijing's perspective, maintaining stability in the Middle East is not just a political goal, it is also an economic necessity that protects China's long-term development strategy.
Another factor shaping China's diplomatic behavior is its broader foreign policy philosophy, which often emphasizes what is called non-interference. This principle means that China generally avoids becoming directly involved in the internal political conflicts of other countries. Instead, Beijing tends to promote dialogue, economic cooperation, and mutual respect between states. This approach allows China to maintain relationships with many different governments at the same time, even when those governments may disagree with each other. By avoiding direct political confrontation, China can protect its economic partnerships while presenting itself as a neutral and stable international actor.
And that philosophy has helped China build strong economic relationships across the Middle East. Over the years, Beijing has developed trade partnerships, infrastructure projects, and investment agreements with many countries in the region. One major example is China's Global Infrastructure Initiative, often referred to as the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to strengthen trade connections between Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. Through projects like ports, railways, and energy investments, China has become deeply connected to the economic future of many Middle Eastern nations, which makes regional stability extremely valuable for Beijing's long-term plans.
Exactly, and this economic integration explains why China usually prefers diplomacy instead of confrontation when dealing with regional tensions. If Beijing were to take strong political sides in every conflict, it could risk damaging important trade partnerships with other countries in the region. Instead, China tries to maintain communication with multiple governments at the same time, encouraging dialogue and peaceful negotiation whenever possible. This balanced approach allows China to continue expanding its economic influence while avoiding the risks that often come with military involvement or aggressive political positioning.
We can also see this diplomatic strategy in how China often positions itself as a supporter of international dialogue and negotiation. Chinese officials frequently call for political solutions to conflicts and encourage countries to resolve disagreements through diplomacy rather than military action. This messaging reflects Beijing's broader belief that long-term stability is more beneficial for global development than short-term geopolitical confrontation. While China certainly protects its national interests, it often chooses methods that emphasize cooperation and economic engagement rather than direct confrontation with other major powers.
Another interesting aspect of China's approach is that it focuses heavily on long-term influence rather than immediate political victories. In many situations, Beijing prefers to quietly build economic partnerships, invest in infrastructure, and expand trade networks instead of making loud geopolitical statements. This strategy may appear slow or quiet compared to traditional power politics, but over time, it can significantly increase China's influence in global affairs. By strengthening economic ties with multiple countries, China gradually builds relationships that can shape regional dynamics in subtle but powerful ways.
That long-term perspective also explains why China's response to tensions involving Iran often sounds measured and diplomatic. Beijing does not want instability to threaten its energy supply or its expanding trade networks across the Middle East. At the same time, China prefers to avoid direct confrontation with other major powers that are involved in the region. Instead, Chinese leaders often encourage dialogue, support diplomatic negotiations, and emphasize the importance of peaceful solutions that maintain regional balance without escalating tensions further.
And when we look at China's global strategy more broadly, we can see that this calm diplomatic style is consistent across many different regions. Whether dealing with economic partnerships in Asia, trade relationships in Europe, or energy connections in the Middle East, China often presents itself as a country that values stability and economic cooperation. By maintaining this image, Beijing strengthens its reputation as a reliable trade partner while avoiding the political risks that sometimes come with aggressive geopolitical competition.
So when observers notice that China appears relatively quiet during crises involving Iran, it does not necessarily mean that Beijing is uninterested or uninvolved. In many cases, China is carefully analyzing the situation, communicating through diplomatic channels, and protecting its economic interests without increasing public tensions. This kind of quiet diplomacy can be very effective because it allows China to remain engaged in regional affairs while avoiding actions that might destabilize an already sensitive situation.
And that is why China's strategy is often described as cautious but strategic. Beijing understands that the Middle East plays a vital role in global energy markets and international trade routes, and it wants to maintain positive relationships with as many countries in the region as possible. By promoting diplomacy, supporting dialogue, and avoiding direct confrontation, China protects its economic interests while also positioning itself as a stabilizing force in global politics.
So in summary, China's careful diplomacy toward Iran is shaped by several important factors: its dependence on Middle Eastern energy, its global trade ambitions, and its long-standing policy of non-interference in the internal politics of other countries. These priorities encourage Beijing to respond calmly during international tensions, focusing on stability and dialogue rather than dramatic geopolitical moves.
And understanding this strategy helps us see why China often appears quiet in moments of crisis. The silence is not necessarily a lack of interest. Instead, it is part of a broader diplomatic approach that values patience, economic cooperation, and long-term influence. In the next section, we will take this discussion even further by exploring how both Russia and China carefully balance their relationships with Iran while also managing their interactions with other powerful countries in the international system.
Julia, as we continue exploring why major powers like Russia and China respond cautiously during tensions involving Iran, we have to examine one of the most powerful forces shaping international decisions: economics. In global politics, economic interests often influence foreign policy just as strongly as military considerations or ideological differences. The Middle East sits at the center of the world's energy system, which means stability in this region directly affects global trade, financial markets, and economic growth. When tensions rise around countries like Iran, investors, governments, and companies all begin watching closely because even small disruptions can send signals across international markets almost immediately.
That's absolutely correct, Adam. And the key reason for this sensitivity is the strategic importance of energy routes in the Middle East. A significant portion of the world's oil passes through waterways in this region before reaching markets in Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world. These routes function like vital highways for the global economy, connecting energy producers with industrial economies that rely on oil and gas to power transportation, manufacturing, and electricity generation. If political instability threatens these routes, energy prices can rise quickly, and that change can influence everything from airline tickets to food production around the world.
Exactly, Julia. And this is why governments carefully monitor political developments near critical maritime routes and energy infrastructure. Global markets are highly sensitive to uncertainty, and whenever news reports suggest that tensions could affect oil shipments or regional stability, traders begin adjusting prices almost instantly. Energy companies, shipping firms, and financial institutions all react to potential risks because their operations depend on predictable supply chains. In other words, the global economy prefers stability, and whenever conflict threatens that stability, the economic consequences can extend far beyond the region where the crisis began.
And this brings us to an important point about how international crises affect financial markets. Modern markets operate on expectations as much as on physical supply and demand. Even the possibility of disruption can cause prices to fluctuate, because investors try to anticipate future developments before they actually occur. When tensions involving Iran increase, energy traders, economists, and policymakers start analyzing scenarios that could affect oil production or transportation. This collective reaction creates waves across global markets, demonstrating how interconnected the world's economic system has become.
Now, if we focus specifically on China, we can see why economic stability in the Middle East is so crucial for Beijing's strategy. China is one of the world's largest importers of oil, and much of that energy comes from countries located in or near the Persian Gulf. This means China's industrial growth, transportation networks, and manufacturing sectors depend heavily on reliable energy imports. If regional tensions threaten the steady flow of oil, it could create challenges for China's economy. Because of this reality, Chinese leaders have strong incentives to support stability and diplomatic solutions whenever tensions increase.
Exactly, Adam. And China's economic strategy over the past several decades has been closely linked to secure access to global energy resources. As China's economy expanded rapidly, its demand for energy increased dramatically. To support that growth, Beijing developed long-term partnerships with many energy-producing countries, including several in the Middle East. These partnerships involve trade agreements, infrastructure investments, and technological cooperation designed to ensure stable energy supplies. Because these relationships are so important for China's economic development, Beijing prefers policies that encourage peace and predictable economic conditions in the region.
Another interesting dimension of this economic equation involves Russia, which approaches the energy question from a very different position compared to China. While China is a major importer of energy, Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas. Energy exports represent a significant part of Russia's national economy and its geopolitical influence. By supplying energy to markets in Europe, Asia, and beyond, Russia plays an important role in the global energy system. This means Moscow must also carefully evaluate how regional conflicts might affect energy prices, market stability, and long-term trade relationships.
That's a fascinating contrast, Adam, because it shows how different economic roles can shape different foreign policy priorities. For China, the main concern is ensuring reliable access to imported energy so that its economy can continue growing smoothly. For Russia, the challenge involves maintaining its position as a major energy supplier while managing competition and market fluctuations. Both countries benefit from stable energy markets, but their economic roles within those markets influence how they approach geopolitical tensions involving countries like Iran.
And this leads to an important observation about the relationship between economics and diplomacy. When countries have significant economic interests connected to a region, they often prefer strategies that minimize the risk of sudden disruptions. This does not mean they ignore political disagreements or security concerns, but it does mean they try to handle those challenges in ways that avoid large-scale instability. For both Russia and China, the Middle East represents an important component of global energy networks, and that reality encourages them to prioritize stability whenever possible.
Another factor worth considering is how global trade routes connect the Middle East to the wider international economy. Shipping lanes in this region link Asian manufacturing centers with European markets and African trade hubs. Millions of barrels of oil, along with countless other goods, move through these routes every day. If conflicts threaten these pathways, the economic impact could reach industries and consumers across multiple continents. That is why governments, shipping companies, and international organizations all pay close attention to developments in this region.
Yes, and this interconnected system illustrates how globalization has transformed international politics. In earlier centuries, conflicts might have affected only nearby regions, but today, economic networks link distant economies together. A political crisis in one part of the world can influence financial markets thousands of kilometers away within minutes. Because of this interconnectedness, major powers often analyze geopolitical events through an economic lens, asking how each development might affect trade, energy supply, and investment flows.
And this economic perspective also helps explain why some countries respond to crises with careful diplomacy rather than dramatic confrontation. Governments understand that escalating tensions can create uncertainty that harms global economic stability. By encouraging dialogue and diplomatic solutions, they attempt to protect international markets from unnecessary shocks. In many ways, economic interdependence encourages countries to act cautiously because the costs of instability are shared by many nations, not just those directly involved in a conflict.
So when we analyze the reactions of Russia and China to tensions involving Iran, it becomes clear that economics plays a central role in shaping their decisions. Both countries have significant interests connected to energy markets, trade routes, and long-term economic partnerships in the Middle East. Because of these interests, they often prefer strategies that maintain stability and avoid sudden disruptions that could affect global markets. This approach reflects a practical understanding that economic security is closely tied to geopolitical stability.
Exactly, Adam. And this shows how international politics is rarely driven by a single factor. Military strategy, diplomacy, and economics all interact with one another to shape the decisions of powerful countries. In the case of Iran and the Middle East, economic considerations such as energy supply, trade networks, and market stability play a major role in guiding the responses of global powers. By examining these economic motivations, we gain a clearer understanding of why certain countries choose caution instead of confrontation when tensions begin to rise.
And that deeper understanding helps us see that what appears to be silence or hesitation in global politics often reflects careful calculation. Governments constantly weigh the potential benefits and risks of every decision, especially when those decisions could influence global markets and international stability. In the next section, we will explore another important factor shaping this cautious behavior: the broader geopolitical competition between major powers and how that competition influences their strategic choices in regions like the Middle East. As we continue our discussion, I think this is the perfect moment to talk about something that many people misunderstand in international politics. When the public sees a crisis unfolding on the global stage, they often expect immediate and dramatic reactions from major powers. People expect strong speeches, urgent military movements, or loud diplomatic statements. But in reality, powerful countries sometimes choose the opposite approach. Instead of reacting quickly, they remain quiet, observe carefully, and allow events to unfold before revealing their position. This approach is often described as strategic patience, and for countries like Russia and China, patience can sometimes be more powerful than immediate action.
That is a really important point, Adam, because silence in diplomacy does not necessarily mean weakness or confusion. In many cases, silence can actually be a deliberate strategy. When governments respond too quickly during a crisis, they may limit their future options or unintentionally escalate tensions. By waiting and observing, leaders gain time to analyze the situation, consult advisors, and study the reactions of other countries. This careful observation helps them understand how the situation is evolving before making a move that could shape international perceptions and relationships for years.
Exactly, Julia. International politics is often compared to a complex strategic game, where every move sends signals to allies, rivals, and global audiences. If a country reacts too quickly, it may reveal its strategy before fully understanding the situation. That is why many experienced diplomats prefer to gather information first and speak later. Strategic patience allows governments to measure the mood of the international community, evaluate potential risks, and prepare responses that align with their long-term goals, rather than reacting emotionally to short-term events.
Another important reason for diplomatic patience is that global crises are rarely simple or predictable. In the early hours or days of a conflict, information can be incomplete or even inaccurate. Governments often receive reports from intelligence agencies, diplomats, and international organizations, and these reports need time to be verified and analyzed. If leaders respond immediately without fully understanding what is happening, they could make decisions based on incorrect assumptions. Waiting allows them to make more informed choices and avoid unnecessary mistakes.
And this is particularly important when dealing with powerful countries like the United States. When tensions rise around regions such as the Middle East, major powers understand that every statement can influence global perceptions and political reactions. If Russia or China respond too aggressively, their statements might increase diplomatic tensions with Washington. But if they remain calm and cautious, they reduce the risk of escalating the situation into a broader geopolitical confrontation. Strategic patience, therefore, becomes a way to maintain stability while still protecting national interests.
Yes, Adam. And this careful approach also helps major powers avoid being pulled into conflicts that do not directly serve their long-term goals. The Middle East is a region with many complex relationships and historical rivalries. If outside powers rush into strong political or military positions, they might become deeply involved in conflicts that are extremely difficult to manage or resolve. By waiting and observing, countries like Russia and China can protect their strategic flexibility and avoid commitments that could limit their future diplomatic choices.
Another advantage of strategic patience is that it allows governments to observe how other countries respond to a crisis. In international politics, reactions from allies, rivals, and regional powers can reveal important information about their priorities and strategies. By watching these reactions carefully, major powers can better understand the political landscape before deciding how to position themselves. This process of observation helps leaders design responses that strengthen their influence rather than weakening it.
And in many cases, waiting also allows tensions to cool naturally. When a crisis first appears in the news, emotions can run very high among governments, media organizations, and the public. Immediate reactions during these moments can sometimes make the situation worse, but if leaders allow time for diplomatic discussions and negotiations to begin, the atmosphere may gradually become less confrontational. Strategic patience therefore creates space for diplomacy, which can reduce the chances of escalation.
This is why experienced diplomats often say that silence itself can send a message. When a powerful country remains calm and avoids dramatic statements, it signals confidence and control. It shows that the government is not reacting emotionally, but is instead carefully managing the situation. In many cases, this calm posture helps maintain credibility and influence in international negotiations, because other countries see that the leadership is focused on long-term strategy rather than short-term political pressure.
And of course, Adam, preserving long-term influence is one of the most important goals for any major power. Countries like Russia and China think in terms of decades, not just days or weeks. Their leaders consider how each decision might affect future alliances, trade partnerships, and diplomatic relationships. If they react too strongly during every crisis, they could damage relationships that took years to build. Strategic patience allows them to maintain those connections while still protecting their national interests.
Another interesting element of strategic patience is the role of quiet diplomacy. Even when governments appear silent in public, they are often very active behind the scenes. Diplomats communicate through private meetings, secure phone calls, and international organizations to exchange information and explore possible solutions. These quiet discussions can sometimes be far more productive than public debates because they allow leaders to speak openly without the pressure of media attention.
Exactly. And this behind-the-scenes diplomacy is often invisible to the public, which is why silence can sometimes be misunderstood. Observers may think that certain countries are doing nothing, when in fact they are carefully negotiating, analyzing data, and coordinating with partners. This quiet work may not create dramatic headlines, but it can shape the outcome of international crises in important ways.
So when we look at the cautious reactions of Russia and China during tensions involving Iran, we can see that their silence may actually reflect a deliberate strategy. By avoiding immediate confrontation, they reduce the risk of escalation with other major powers while preserving their ability to influence events later. This strategic patience allows them to observe developments, protect their interests, and maintain flexibility in a complex international environment.
And that idea leads us to a powerful lesson about global politics. Sometimes the most important decisions are not the loudest ones. In diplomacy, patience, observation, and careful timing can be just as powerful as dramatic actions. Silence can create space for negotiation, prevent unnecessary conflict, and allow leaders to choose the right moment to act.
Exactly, Julia. Strategic patience reminds us that international relations is often a long-term game where timing and restraint are essential. Major powers understand that every move can shape the global balance of influence, which is why they sometimes choose to wait, watch, and think before speaking. In the next section, we will explore how regional politics in the Middle East also influence the behavior of global powers and why local dynamics play such an important role in shaping international responses. Julia, after discussing Russia and China, it's important to shift our focus to the United States, which remains one of the most influential players in Middle Eastern politics. The U.S. has decades of involvement in the region, shaped by security commitments, alliances, and strategic interests. From Washington's perspective, Iran represents both a challenge and a potential threat to regional stability, and the American approach is often shaped by a combination of military, economic, and diplomatic considerations. Understanding Washington's position helps explain why other global powers, like Russia and China, often choose more cautious responses.
That's right, Adam. One of the first things to understand is the network of alliances that the United States maintains in the Middle East. Countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states have strong security relationships with Washington, including intelligence sharing, arms sales, and joint military exercises. These alliances create a framework in which the US can influence regional developments, respond to crises quickly, and project power across the Middle East. From Washington's perspective, these partnerships are not just about protecting allies. They also serve to maintain a strategic balance in the region.
Absolutely, Julia. And alongside alliances, we need to consider America's security commitments. The U.S. has stationed military forces in several Middle Eastern countries, maintained naval presence in critical waterways, and developed rapid response capabilities to deter potential conflicts. These commitments allow Washington to act if regional tensions escalate, but they also signal to other global powers, including Russia and China, that the United States is closely monitoring developments. This ability to project military power often affects how other nations position themselves during crises.
Another key concept here is strategic deterrence. The United States uses a combination of military presence, advanced technology, and alliances to discourage aggressive actions by regional actors. For example, if Iran were to take military action that threatens US allies or critical infrastructure, the US has mechanisms in place to respond decisively. This deterrence is designed to reduce the risk of escalation while maintaining influence over the region. At the same time, the presence of US forces and alliances can create complex dynamics, influencing how other powers, such as Russia and China, approach the situation.
Exactly, Julia. From Washington's perspective, the reactions, or lack thereof, of Russia and China are carefully observed. U.S. officials often analyze whether these countries are supporting Iran directly, remaining neutral, or subtly signaling approval without overt engagement. These reactions influence American calculations in terms of diplomacy, military planning, and economic measures. For example, if Russia or China were to provide overt support to Iran during a crisis, the United States might adjust its alliances, military posture, or sanctions policies accordingly.
And it's important to note that the US also balances between public statements and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. While Washington may issue firm warnings or condemnations in public forums like the United Nations, much of the actual negotiation happens quietly through back channels, multilateral institutions, and diplomatic engagement. This dual approach allows the United States to maintain its strategic credibility while keeping room for negotiation and de-escalation, a strategy that reflects the complexity of modern international relations.
Another dimension of the U.S. role is economic influence. Beyond military commitments, the United States has significant leverage through trade relationships, financial institutions, and sanctions mechanisms. Sanctions on Iran, for example, have historically been a key tool for Washington to influence Tehran's behavior without resorting to direct military action. This economic leverage also sends signals to other global powers about what the United States considers acceptable behavior in the region.
Exactly. And in observing Russia and China, US policymakers often weigh whether these powers are acting in ways that support or undermine American objectives. The relative silence of Moscow and Beijing may be interpreted as caution, strategic patience, or an attempt to avoid direct confrontation with the United States. By carefully watching how these major powers behave, Washington can adjust its diplomatic, military, and economic strategies to maintain influence and stability in the region.
So, in summary, the U.S. role in the Middle East is multidimensional. It involves strong alliances, military presence, strategic deterrence, economic influence, and close observation of other major powers. These elements shape not only how America responds to crises, but also how countries like Russia and China choose to act or remain silent when tensions rise.
And understanding the American position gives us important insight into the global balance of power. The United States' alliances, commitments, and strategies create a framework that other major powers must navigate carefully. This context explains why Russia and China often prefer quiet diplomacy, strategic patience, and calculated observation, rather than immediate overt support or confrontation.
Exactly, Julia. And as we move forward in our discussion, we'll see how these economic, military, and diplomatic factors all intersect, shaping the cautious and calculated approaches of global powers during the current Iran crisis. Julia, now that we've explored the positions of Russia, China, and the United States individually, it's time to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about Iran or a single regional crisis. It's about global power competition in the 21st century. The Middle East has always been strategically important, but today, conflicts there are closely connected to the broader struggle among the world's leading powers. Every move, every statement, every choice to act or remain silent sends signals that ripple far beyond the region. Understanding this helps us see why superpowers approach crises like the one involving Iran with such caution and calculation.
Absolutely, Adam. One of the first things to consider is that the world today is highly interconnected. Military, economic, and diplomatic actions in one region can affect global influence in other regions. For example, how Russia or China positions itself during tensions in the Middle East can influence how other countries perceive their strength, reliability, and strategic vision. Every action, or inaction, is part of a broader narrative about global power, competition, and long-term influence. Major powers are constantly aware of how their behavior is interpreted internationally.
Exactly, Julia. In fact, modern international relations is as much about strategic messaging as it is about direct action. When a crisis occurs, countries not only evaluate the immediate regional situation, but also think about the global message their behavior sends. For instance, a strong public statement or aggressive move could signal power to allies and rivals alike, but it could also escalate tensions or create long-term liabilities. On the other hand, a measured response or deliberate silence can signal restraint, careful calculation, and long-term strategic thinking. Superpowers are always playing multiple games at once, balancing public perception with practical geopolitical calculations.
And that is why the Middle East often becomes a stage for indirect competition among global powers. Countries like Russia and China are not simply passive observers. They are actively assessing how their actions, or inactions, affect their global standing. For instance, supporting a regional actor too openly could strengthen influence locally but strain relationships elsewhere. Remaining strategically quiet allows these powers to preserve credibility, maintain flexibility, and avoid being drawn into conflicts that do not serve their long-term goals. This is a key feature of modern great power competition. Influence is exerted not only through direct involvement, but also through careful signaling.
Exactly, Julia. And let's not forget that the United States is also carefully watching how other powers respond. Washington interprets actions and statements from Russia and China in the context of its global competition. Every crisis becomes a lens through which major powers evaluate each other's strategic priorities, strengths, and weaknesses. For example, if Moscow or Beijing supports Iran overtly, it may challenge U.S. influence in the region and globally. If they remain quiet, it may indicate strategic patience, avoidance of direct confrontation, or prioritization of other regions. Either way, these decisions are closely analyzed by policymakers, military strategists, and economic planners around the world.
And in this context, we also have to consider the role of regional actors. Middle Eastern countries are aware that the behavior of superpowers affects their own leverage. Nations like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are constantly observing how major powers balance economic interests, security commitments, and diplomatic signaling. Their own strategies are shaped not only by immediate threats, but also by the way global powers compete for influence. This creates a dynamic where regional and global strategies are tightly interconnected, meaning that crises in Iran are rarely just regional. They are part of the broader chessboard of international relations.
That's a crucial point, Julia. Great power competition today often involves a combination of economic, military, and diplomatic tools, rather than just direct conflict. Countries project influence by building trade relationships, investing in infrastructure abroad, providing defense technology, or even carefully managing the timing and tone of public statements. In this sense, crises like the Iran tension are opportunities for superpowers to test and communicate their influence without necessarily engaging in military confrontation. Every choice sends signals to the world about priorities, alliances, and credibility.
And it's also worth noting that in the 21st century, global power is no longer just about territorial control or military dominance. Economic strength, technological capacity, and diplomatic skill are equally important. For instance, China's Belt and Road Initiative and investments in Middle Eastern energy infrastructure demonstrate how economic influence can complement political influence. Similarly, Russia's energy exports and strategic alliances show that resource control can be just as powerful as conventional military power. The Iran crisis, while regional in scope, becomes a microcosm of this broader competition for influence.
Exactly. And superpowers are very aware that public perception matters as much as real capabilities. A country may have strong military forces, but if its diplomatic strategy or public messaging is misread, it can lose credibility on the global stage. For this reason, Measured silence, careful negotiation, and subtle diplomacy often become strategic tools. Russia and China, for example, may appear quiet to the general public, but behind the scenes, they are actively managing influence, assessing risks, and positioning themselves to maximize long-term advantage without creating unnecessary conflict.
And this brings us to another key point about global power competition. It's long-term and multidimensional. Countries do not simply react to crises in isolation. They anticipate the impact of their actions across different regions and sectors. Military moves, trade agreements, energy policies, and diplomatic statements all interact in ways that influence global rankings of influence, trust, and credibility. Crises like Iran provide a lens through which these interactions become visible, helping us understand the careful calculations behind seemingly quiet responses.
Exactly, Julia. In other words, the silence of major powers during regional tensions is often a deliberate strategy within the broader context of 21st century power competition. By observing events, balancing multiple interests, and signaling influence in nuanced ways, countries like Russia and China are actively shaping the international system. Their behavior in one regional crisis is part of a larger strategy to maintain credibility, project influence, and prepare for future challenges across the globe.
And from the perspective of global audiences, this highlights an important lesson. International politics is rarely about immediate action alone. Great power competition is a constant balancing act, where every decision carries implications for global influence, alliances, and economic interests. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why the Iran crisis, while centered in one region, is watched so closely by countries and markets worldwide.
So when we connect the crisis in Iran to the broader global power competition, we begin to see the full picture. Each country's careful strategic behavior is not merely about the region, it's about positioning, influence, and long-term advantage on a global scale. And in the next section, Julia, we'll explore how media, perception, and messaging amplify these dynamics, shaping how the world interprets every move, statement, or silence. As we've explored the strategic calculations of major powers and the global context of the Iran crisis, it's natural to ask, what might happen next? What scenarios could unfold in the coming weeks and months? While predicting the future is never simple, we can identify several plausible paths, each shaped by diplomacy, regional dynamics, and international influence. Understanding these possibilities helps us see how carefully global powers must act, because each choice carries economic, political, and security consequences that extend far beyond Iran itself.
Exactly, Adam. Let's start with the most hopeful scenario: diplomatic solutions. In this pathway, regional actors, supported by global powers, engage in negotiations to reduce tensions. For example, the United States might engage in dialogue with Iran through intermediaries, while Russia and China could use their influence to encourage compromise and stability. If successful, diplomacy could prevent military escalation, protect vital energy routes, and create a framework for long-term cooperation. Even small diplomatic successes, like agreements on inspections, arms limitations, or humanitarian cooperation, could send powerful signals to the international community that conflict is avoidable.
Yes, and diplomatic solutions are often supported by international organizations like the United Nations. These institutions provide forums for discussion, negotiation, and conflict resolution, and they can help mediate disputes in ways that reduce risk. For instance, UN resolutions, humanitarian initiatives, or observer missions can create a structure for dialogue and monitoring. Global powers often leverage these institutions to support their interests quietly while maintaining a public image of restraint and cooperation. In this way, diplomacy and institutional engagement can coexist with strategic patience, allowing countries to protect their influence without unnecessary confrontation.
On the other hand, Adam, there is always the possibility of regional escalation. Even small incidents, like missile exchanges, airstrikes, or border skirmishes, could rapidly trigger broader conflict if not managed carefully. When multiple actors are involved, regional powers, local militias, and global powers, there is always a risk that miscalculations could escalate tensions. For example, if Iran responds to perceived threats with force and allies like Russia or proxies in the region become involved, the situation could spiral in ways that none of the parties originally intended. This is why measured responses and quiet diplomacy are so critical in moments like this.
Absolutely, Julia. Escalation doesn't only mean military conflict, it can also manifest in economic and strategic pressures. For instance, disruptions to energy exports, sanctions, or cyber actions could have significant consequences for regional and global markets. Energy prices might spike, trade could be disrupted, and companies around the world could face uncertainty. As we discussed earlier, both China and Russia have strong economic interests in stability, so even indirect economic consequences are closely monitored. These factors make escalation risky not just for the countries directly involved, but for the global economy as a whole.
And this brings us to another scenario: economic consequences as a driver of diplomacy. In the past, major powers have sometimes been pulled into agreements or negotiations primarily because economic disruption became too costly. For example, oil price fluctuations, global market instability, or trade disruptions can create pressure on governments to seek solutions quickly. In the case of Iran, global energy markets are particularly sensitive, meaning that even limited disruptions can influence diplomatic decisions in ways that are as significant as military or political considerations.
Exactly. Then there's the role of multilateral engagement, Julia. International organizations, regional bodies, and coalitions often provide mechanisms to manage crises before they become uncontrollable. This could include economic forums, diplomatic coalitions, or security alliances that create platforms for negotiation. These structures allow countries to engage without directly confronting each other militarily, and they provide transparency and accountability that can prevent misunderstandings. For global powers like Russia, China, and the US, supporting these forums, publicly or behind the scenes, can be an effective way to maintain influence while managing risk.
Another factor is public perception and messaging. How governments communicate about the crisis can influence both domestic and international reactions. Even when leaders choose strategic patience or quiet diplomacy, the way events are reported and interpreted can create pressure to act more decisively. Social media, international news outlets, and regional media all shape narratives, and global powers carefully consider the impact of their messaging. Miscommunication or misperception could inflame tensions or limit future options, which is why controlling the narrative is almost as important as the actual actions on the ground.
And finally, Julia, we should emphasize the uncertainty inherent in all these scenarios. The Middle East is a complex region with overlapping political, social, and religious dynamics. Local actors, international powers, and non-state groups all interact in ways that can be unpredictable. Even carefully planned strategies can be disrupted by unexpected events, from political assassinations to sudden protests or accidents. This uncertainty is precisely why major powers like Russia and China often exercise caution. The risks of overreaction are high, and mistakes can have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly, Adam. In essence, the future of the Iran crisis is not predetermined. Several paths exist: diplomatic resolution, limited escalation, economic disruption, or more extensive regional conflict. But the outcome depends on how carefully regional and global powers manage their actions. Each move must balance security, economic interests, alliances and perception, creating a highly intricate and delicate process.
So, in summary, while no one can predict the future with certainty, analyzing these possible scenarios helps us understand the logic behind the careful and measured responses of superpowers. Strategic patience, diplomatic engagement, and economic considerations all play roles in shaping what might happen next. By observing these patterns, we can better interpret global actions and understand why countries like Russia and China sometimes appear quiet while the world watches anxiously.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, it's important to remember that international crises are rarely black and white. Understanding the possible scenarios, the motivations of each actor, and the interplay between diplomacy, economics, and military strategy allows us to approach these complex issues thoughtfully and critically. It also shows us why calm, informed observation can be more powerful than reactionary judgment in both global politics and in understanding world events.
And with that perspective in mind, we're ready to conclude our episode. In our final section, we'll reflect on the lessons from this crisis, explore what it teaches us about global power dynamics, and highlight the importance of critical thinking when following international events. As we wrap up today's discussion, I think the main takeaway is clear. International crises like the tensions surrounding Iran are shaped by a complex mix of power politics, economic interests, and strategic patience. Russia and China's careful silence, the United States' alliances and security commitments, and the broader global competition all demonstrate that diplomacy and caution often carry more weight than immediate action. Understanding these dynamics helps us see the world as a network of careful calculations, where every choice has long-term consequences.
Absolutely, Adam. And for our listeners, it's important to follow global news calmly and thoughtfully. By observing events carefully and considering the motivations of all actors, we gain a clearer understanding of how the world works. At the same time, engaging with international topics like this is a powerful way to improve your English, expand your vocabulary, and learn to think critically about global events.
Exactly, Julia. Today we've seen that silence can be a strategy, diplomacy is a tool, and economic considerations often guide decisions. These lessons apply not only to countries and leaders, but also to how we interpret news and form our own perspectives about the world.
So let's end with a reflective thought. Even in moments of tension, there is always space for dialogue, understanding, and the pursuit of peace. By learning about global affairs, discussing ideas critically, and approaching conflicts with patience and insight, we can appreciate the value of diplomacy and cooperation in shaping a more stable world.
Thank you for joining us on this episode. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember that understanding the world helps us become better thinkers, better learners, and better global citizens.
And as always, keep exploring, keep learning English, and never underestimate the power of knowledge and calm reflection in shaping both your language skills and your understanding of the world.